Welcome back. I hope that you guys are all not completely losing it. I'm really excited about today. So last time, Trey and I kind of complained at each other for a while. As I just was talking to Trey and Felicia, after that complaining session, Felicia messaged me to say, are you going insane? What's wrong with you? And I said, yes, I am going insane. But it was a really lucky time that she did that because, as I'm sure many of you have noticed, we've seen reports about changes in our understanding of coronavirus or the scientific understanding of coronavirus, what safety measures to take, and then probably biggest on the news that I'm watching is the prospects of vaccines and how those have changed. So in response to Felicia's email about whether I have just gone off the deep end, we were able to ask her to come back on. So she was our very first guest on Closing Bell, and she talked us through kind of our understanding of coronavirus in, I guess it was late March. Is that right, Felicia?
I think so. It was actually that long ago now.
Yeah,
so
months
I don't think
ago.
she was not only was she our first guest, she was actually our first question as well.
That's true.
The answer to the question was ask Felicia Wu. So it really
she said, this is Felicia Wu.
so again, it's one of those situations where we have no idea what's going on with the world, and so we go to the experts. Another really exciting development is so the three of us wrote a paper that was formally accepted this week on kind of the role of essential labor, or the kind of designation of essential labor on transmission, and thinking about that as a pandemic response policy. So that's formally accepted. It's in proofs right now. So that paper should be released soon. We might actually just go ahead and post kind of the working version since it's already accepted and good to go. But you know, we've been doing a ton of work with Felicia, and super excited to talk to you because, like, I mean, this stuff's kind of outside of our wheelhouse. So any insights you can give us is going to be great.
Well, it's been a real pleasure to work with both of you since that, I guess, that one participation in Closing Bell all those months ago. Yeah, we really have done quite a lot together.
Yeah.
So can you tell us, Felicia, I think certainly Trey and my kind of layman's understanding of coronavirus has definitely changed since we talked last, but I guess recently, especially recently, it feels like we've gotten all kinds of conflicting information about the coronavirus is evolving, the coronavirus is infecting kids now, the coronavirus is evolving to spread more rapidly, or in Italy they say it's evolving to be less deadly. Do you have any kind of thoughts on where we are with all that stuff?
It's so complex, isn't it? Because it's not just one story of COVID-19. It's all of these individual moving parts within COVID-19, and overlaid on top of that are policies and questions about what will happen if schools are going to be opening again in the fall. So it's just been a lot to keep on top of. And it's not as though we're just trying to keep on top of one topic, which is COVID-19. It's what's actually happening with respect to the virus that causes it, SARS-CoV-2, what's happening with regards to medical treatments, including the development of a vaccine, what's happening with regards to aerosols versus droplets versus surfaces. I'm happy to try to touch on each of these one by one. So if you would like to pick a topic to start, I will be glad to.
Oh no, I thought I did pick a topic.
I can start with a somewhat hopeful message.
Oh, good. Okay.
Yeah, that's a great start. We're really bad at the hopeful part, so this is going to be great.
All right. I'll be happy to share some of the most recent developments as far as our progress as a whole on developing COVID-19 vaccines that are safe and efficacious for use in humans. Some of you may have had the chance to tune in on Facebook yesterday when Mark Zuckerberg interviewed Dr. Anthony Fauci. Did you have the chance to listen?
I watched a little bit of it, yeah.
So he clarified some good news that had actually come from 3 days ago. There was a publication in the high-ranking medical journal, the New England Journal of Medicine, that a company, Moderna, which is based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, has now successfully completed phase 1 and phase 2 of their clinical trials. And as of later this month is going to move on to phase 3 clinical trials. And in fact, they are actively recruiting participants for this right now. To walk this back a little bit so that people understand the context, it's very important before we, even though we are desperate as a global community for a vaccine, it's absolutely critical to make sure that that vaccine is safe. Otherwise, we'll be injecting a number of people and there could be really harmful effects. Therefore, although we are speeding up the process quite a bit in the development of this vaccine, still it needs to go through a number of different phases to ensure its safety and its efficacy. Phase 0 trials, they're not clinical trials, are actually when the vaccine is tested in animals, in laboratory animals, just to make sure that there are no adverse effects and to see whether in fact it's efficacious in the animals in preventing disease development. Phase 1 clinical trials are primarily to test the safety in humans, and that's typically done in 45 individuals. So a number of biotech companies around the world are in the middle of or have already completed their phase 1 clinical trials for COVID-19 vaccines. A number have moved on to phase 2, which involves several hundreds of human subjects. And that is when the safety is further tested, and now we can begin to test for the efficacy of the vaccine as well. Now, this one group, Moderna, has actually moved forward. They published their results 3 days ago in New England Journal of Medicine, and now they are recruiting about 30,000 individuals across the United States. And they're looking specifically in hotspot areas in the United States. So for example, Austin, Texas, among other places, where they're looking for human volunteers to receive 2 doses of their mRNA-based vaccine. And so far, and this is fine to share, they just published on this, the results look really promising.
Can I ask about that? So I've been following a little bit that, but I don't understand when the phase 2 test, which is does the vaccine elicit an immunoresponse in individuals? I guess I don't know how to take that. Does it elicit an immunoresponse to, will it successfully fight off coronavirus?
Absolutely, yeah, that's a great question. So the purpose of any vaccine is to stimulate certain parts of our immune system, such that if we were to become exposed to the virus, consequently, then our immune system is already primed to respond immediately so that we don't develop severe illness. In fact, our immune systems are working, but we don't necessarily have to become sick, or if we do become sick, the illness is much less severe. So the wonderful thing about this particular mRNA vaccine that has been developed by Moderna is that what they showed in their phase 2 clinical trial was that after a moderate dose of this vaccine, it turned out that humans elicited a particular antibody response, and it's the antibodies that are basically attacking the viruses that invade our bodies. The antibody response was actually stronger than that we found in actual recovered COVID-19 patients. Okay. In other words, if people were already exposed to and became ill with COVID-19 and then they recovered, that meant that their bodies were already generating antibodies, and this vaccine causes an even greater level of antibody response. So that's a very positive finding. And now
okay,
we're testing.
I'm going to ask you a couple dumb questions. So I apologize before I ask these stupid questions. So I have heard that people can contract coronavirus twice. So how does that work? And does that mean that there is this, like the coronavirus is mutating? And if it is, how does a vaccine deal with a mutated coronavirus?
So Trey, I was reading those studies too, and at least the one article that I'd read about it, and maybe you can tell me if you read something different, that the first time that the individual thought that he or she had the coronavirus, they were not actually tested for it. They had the symptoms. And then later they tested positive for it. So it's not clear, back in February and March when many of us would have been getting sick from flu and other, and other infectious diseases, whether in fact that was the coronavirus back then. It might be possible, and here's a possible explanation of it. If an individual was in fact infected with coronavirus and did not have a very strong response, maybe because the viral load was not that high, then they may not have mounted a very strong antibody response. Therefore, if they were to encounter the virus again, then they might have more severe symptoms, and now their bodies are attempting to generate a stronger immune response.
And
that's
so
a possibility.
Within that immune response, in malaria, I believe, you eventually lose your immunity after some time if you're not increasingly exposed to that's not a virus, it's a different bug, right? But is that a possibility here that we could eventually lose our immunity?
It's always a possibility for two reasons. One is our immune response, and the second is possible mutations of the virus itself. As far as an immune response, there are so the antibodies include a number of what are called immunoglobulins, not to get into a lot of detail about, about these different compounds, but certain types of immunoglobulins, specifically we want to elicit one called IgG, an IgG response. And if we're able to elicit an IgG response and it lasts for a fairly long time, then maybe we could go for years at a time before we have to get a booster shot. It's not clear simply because we haven't had the virus in our population long enough to know exactly how long that's going to last. And as we've seen in the case of flu vaccines, well, it's a different strain of flu that's likely to infect the global population, indeed several different strains of flu. And that's why every year we need to get a different flu shot. We can't just have been vaccinated once and that takes care of us for the rest of our lives. So we still need to learn more about this. We still need to know more about the mutation of the virus, and we also need to know how long our IgG response is effective.
And let me ask you other questions that we don't know answers to, just because I just need to get them off of my chest, I guess. But the concept of herd immunity, right, depends, I guess, on some portion of the population being immune, whether that's through being infected and fighting it off or through this vaccine. My understanding is that we don't expect for any of these vaccines to be 100% effective or effective in 100% of individuals that get the vaccine. Do you know what we can potentially expect in terms of efficacy of the Moderna vaccine or some other vaccine, and what the chances are for herd immunity in that instance? I guess holding first constant that we don't get some rapid changes in the virus itself.
Right. That's a good question, and it has several different parts. You were right in your definition of herd immunity, and just to explain to anybody who might have a question about it, herd immunity is this collective protective response in a population, which means that it's very unlikely for the virus to take hold and then cause a pandemic within that community again. That can be achieved through herd immunity, which means that enough of the individuals have already had the virus, so they already have antibodies to protect against it so that they don't become very sick and then spread it to other people, or because they got the vaccine. And so they have the same antibodies, they wouldn't react very strongly. And that means that even if there are some individuals who neither got the vaccine nor actually contracted the virus themselves, they can still be protected because it's very unlikely that they'll get it from somebody else in the community. The determinant of herd immunity is what the R0 is. And I think that those of you who have been following coronavirus have heard a lot about this notion of R0. And R0 is a very flexible term. It's this idea of how contagious is this virus? How easily transmissible is it under natural conditions? Well, natural conditions vary in rural areas in Montana versus in East Lansing, Michigan versus in New York City, because it all has to do with how many people you're being exposed to on a daily basis. R naught for SARS-CoV-2, which causes COVID-19, appears to be quite high. It certainly is much higher than the seasonal flu. Some people are saying it's in the 2-point-something range. Other people have said it's as high as the 5-point-something range. The higher the R naught is, that is, the more easily transmissible it is, the more people need to be vaccinated, or the more people need to have gotten the flu, the disease and recovered from it. A very, very high percentage. So for example, the study that estimated R naught to be 5.7, they said, well, what this means is that 82% of your community has to have either been vaccinated or already been infected with SARS-CoV-2. But other people, including the New England Journal of Medicine, Lancet, other studies are saying, no, R naught is actually kind of between 2 and 3. Then maybe only about 55 to 60% of the population needs to be vaccinated, and the vaccine has to be effective, or they had to have acquired COVID-19 immunity because they already had the disease.
And so if it is, let's say that the world is good for a change, and it's that 50% number rather than the 82% number, is that a realistic goal for a vaccine to be 50% effective?
I think that the companies that are working on the vaccine right now are aiming for quite a bit higher than.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. Okay, Alex, you're an idiot. Okay.
No, it's not. No, it's a good question, because you probably, Alex, you've worked in malaria. You know that the anti-malarial vaccine had something
25%, I think.
a really low percentage,
Yeah.
something like 39%, and they said, this is great, this is wonderful. So any level of efficacy is a good thing in the vaccine. Ideally, we would see quite a bit higher than 50%, and we don't know that yet until these much larger phase 3 clinical trials. I think that now that Moderna and other companies are trying to get a test population of 30,000 people, they're going to get a lot more information, and hopefully they'll communicate it soon to us in general. You know, what's the level of efficacy of the vaccine in the population?
I just have, yeah, go for it, Trey. I have like 7 million questions, so you can do one.
To clarify, so like when we're talking about vaccines, the odds are these vaccines are going to be less effective in different places, like more effective in some places than others, or is it? So what I'm thinking about right now is, so there was actually, let me just share this because I think it's super fascinating. So the New York Times ran this article that has, so they had like this map of the United States broken down by the chance that, like, on a random encounter, all 5 of the people in that random encounter were wearing masks. Okay, and so if you look at this map, and it makes it look like there's this like incredible data behind it and everything else. It wasn't entirely clear what was going on in the map, to be honest. And so like, so a few people started talking about it. And if you look at population density in the United States, it maps almost perfectly correlated with this prior map.
That is so cool.
So what's interesting to me is does that mean that the data collection is weird, or what? Like, it's just a different thing in different places then is what I'm envisioning. So the efficacy of a vaccine in middle of nowhere Wyoming is probably going to have a higher efficacy than like some higher population density place, or am I thinking about this completely wrong? I just, part of it is I just wanted to have an excuse to show this map because I think it's super fascinating. But the other part is like I feel like there's just so much regionalism to this that I just don't understand.
So it's you've asked a really packed question, Trey, and so yeah. I'll try to deal with one part at a time. When you're asking about, are there certain people for whom the vaccine is more likely to be more efficacious or effective than others? I think let's talk about it in individuals versus in populations. There are a number of studies that indicate that immunoglobulin response in the elderly tends to be somewhat compromised.
Ah, okay.
And therefore, And we see this with other vaccines as well. For example, the flu vaccine. And so what you probably know about is that individuals over the age of 65 actually get quite a packed flu, a different flu vaccine than others of us get. And it's precisely because they're not as likely to generate a strong immunoglobulin response. So there is some person-to-person variability in how effective this COVID-19 vaccine, when it comes out, is likely to be, and it has to do with their own individual vulnerability. Trey, I think what you were asking about, though, I mean, since you showed the map, is kind of on a population scale,
Well,
right?
so what I'm thinking about is, so for example, my grandparents live in rural Oklahoma, and they had like a super big 4th of July celebration, just like usual, which is really concerning to me because like there are a bunch of pork processing plants just down the street from this place.
Oh,
And
wow.
so like, you know, but then I start thinking, okay, maybe in rural open places, it's less of a concern versus in these urban cores, which tend to be the hotspots for a lot of the, especially the mortality rates.
You know, you're absolutely right, Trey, because now you're talking about it from a population level, and the R naught, or let's call it more accurately RT. The RT is simply different. When you're in a very sparsely populated place, you don't run into that many people aside from immediate family, and so you know the RT is going to be very low because you're just not running into that many people. So if an individual were infected, what are the chances, how many other people is that individual going to infect? That's going to be much lower if they're not interacting with that many people. RT is lower. But in a packed metropolitan area, even for the same virus, even given the same proportion of individuals who are vaccinated, well, the RT is going to be quite a bit higher simply because one infected individual is likely to be interacting with many other people. So the chances that they will infect more people is higher.
So can I ask a question about that? So to me, Trey's map is almost, I guess, reassuring to me in that it suggests people are a little bit rational in that, like you said, the places with the greatest population density were those where people were most likely to wear masks. So to take those preventative precautions. I wonder about the same decision-making process. So say we've got a vaccine that's very efficacious. How likely are we to get a sufficient number of people to volunteer to take this vaccine, even knowing that it is efficacious? And so so there's that human decision on the way to this herd immunity story.
Right. So again, this is a multi-part question, Alex.
Oh no,
so
okay, sorry.
No, that's great, that's great. And because it all flows together. In that brief time that Trey put up that map, I noticed one thing, and Trey, you can correct me if I'm wrong about it. It's if you run into 5 people, how likely is it that the 5 will be wearing a mask? So it's not really a matter of population density. It's just what are the people in that area, whether it's sparsely populated or densely populated, what are they likely to be doing? So I think that that overlaying the population map and this map is not quite the right overlay. I may have misinterpreted it, but
no, you're interpreting it right. That it's the probability that all 5 of the people in a random interaction are wearing masks at the same time.
Then population density doesn't really matter. I mean, of course it does, as far as
trying to control for it is the idea.
Yeah, viral transmission, but this is more about behavioral aspects, as I understand it. Where are people likely to be wearing masks, irrespective of the population density? And it does make sense that people are less likely to be wearing masks where population densities are low, because the RT was quite a bit lower. So that part absolutely makes sense. From the behavioral perspective, if I'm kind of reading between the lines of what you asked, Alex, is the question, are those individuals who will voluntarily wear masks also be more likely to also get the vaccine?
Well, a couple of different points there. The fact that we've got evidence that not everybody's wearing masks. So we've got already something that's not a vaccine, but it's this preventative measure, and people are choosing not to do that. And we also know from a whole bunch of other vaccines we've had in the past, there are many people that choose not to get themselves vaccinated, to get their kids vaccinated. I guess coupling those things together, what do you, Felicia, who is smarter than me, anticipate in terms of uptake of this vaccine, given that it eventually exists?
Particularly given how quick the vaccine has been developed, do you think that there's like, I mean, I could envision a lot of people being like, well, I don't want to be the first person to get that vaccine. You know, so I mean, even with the development of a vaccine, do you think there's going to be some type of a behavioral challenge to actually utilizing this technology?
I think given the history of the anti-vax movement, not just here in the US, but in other parts of the world, we are going to run into a challenge. The question is, what proportion of the population will that pertain to? I think that, so on the safety question, Trey, you mentioned the reluctance that some people might have, like the first penguin being pushed off the cliff, right, into the oceans that might get eaten by whatever predators are there. Who wants to be the first to get the vaccine? Some fairly reassuring information is that all of these vaccine trials are being overseen by the Data and Safety Monitoring Board in the United States, to make sure that if they begin to see in any of these phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials that a lot of people are getting unexpected adverse effects from being injected with a vaccine, then they will stop the clinical trial. So it will only pass phase 3 if in that very large study population, it proved safe the entire time. So it certainly does make me feel reassured that when a vaccine is approved in the United States, that it will have been vetted very carefully for safety. So for myself, even though I am very cautious as far as health is concerned, I would not mind being one of the first people to get a vaccine after it is approved by FDA. I think that your question, though, is a really good one. I think not everybody is aware that there are such strict safety standards such that when we do finally come out with a COVID-19 vaccine, it has a very, very high probability of safety. And so my hope is that enough people will get this vaccine such that we are able to reach herd immunity, so that even those that decided that they didn't want to get vaccinated, or they didn't want their kids to get vaccinated, these kids could still go to school, they could still go to their workplaces and not become sick and not infect other people.
That was a little bit of a political answer. You ended with, my hope is that this will happen.
Yes.
But and I totally understand.
Well, I don't want people to get sick and die, so yeah.
Well, of course, yeah. Yeah. I just wonder if you have any, I guess my frustration with this, you're more well-spoken and I think more able to filter yourself, so I'm just gonna let it all hang out. My frustration with this is that we've seen, and Trey and I talked about this a lot last week, a whole bunch of misinformation, active misinformation with respect to the mask thing,
Yes.
but also not necessarily the COVID vaccine, but vaccines in the past where there's been huge outcries that vaccines cause autism, sudden death in children. So I also am with you, Felicia, that I hope that this thing will work in herd immunity and then we'll all hug. I'm a little, I think maybe more pessimistic than you're at least letting out that you are.
So before you jump in, I just want to throw this figure up here because I think it gives me a little bit of hope on that side of things. So this is different countries and the likelihood that people are wearing masks in this survey data from June 22nd and the 28th.
Will you zoom in a little bit, dude?
Yeah. There. Is that better?
That's so much better, yeah.
Okay, so the question is, how often people from different places say they wear a mask when they leave the house? So the Philippines and Mexico is coming in at like 85, 92%. The U.S. is 59%, which obviously is not ideal, but apparently we're better than Canada or the UK. And so like, I don't know. Sometimes I wonder if like the squeaky wheels getting the grease here, that we like, there are folks who aren't wearing masks that are receiving the lion's share of the platform right now, where still the majority of Americans say that they're always wearing a mask when they're leaving their house.
But Canada and the UK both have less cases in their whole
Yeah.
countries than we have in Michigan alone. So I'm
Well,
not sure
quit
that's a totally
raining on my
fair.
parade. I'm trying to
Sorry.
tell a nice, happy story here. But I mean, you're not wrong. But look at Sweden. You know, I mean, Sweden. I think they've figured out certain. I mean, Sweden. 86% of Swedish people say they're not wearing a mask ever when they go out in public. And I don't know what to make of that, and I think that merits a whole episode in and of itself. Is starting to understand where we sit in the rest of the world here.
Yes.
But at least in terms of, you know, over half of Americans are saying they're wearing masks right now, all the time, always. And almost all Americans, 86% of Americans are saying they're at least most of the time wearing a mask. So, I mean, we're not all in that camp that aren't wearing masks, you know, and I'd like to think that when you're when you're saying like, well, I hope that a certain percentage of Americans are willing to go for a vaccine. Yeah, you might hear from 14% of Americans a lot, but there are going to be 86% of us that are going to be more than willing to quit doing this, because I'm tired of coronavirus world. I would love to have a vaccine. Give me 6 vaccines. I don't care. Take 6 shots in my arm. I'm happy with it. I will take it.
You will need 6 shots. So. Possibly 2, you know, like a booster, the primary vaccine and then a booster. You know, I see what you're saying, Trey. It really is a matter of the squeaky wheel causing fear. And it's true that it's entirely likely that those individuals who say that they're not going to wear a mask and are quite have a more somewhat defiant attitude about that. Likewise, the individuals who do not want to get vaccinated and also don't want to have their children vaccinated, it's quite possible that these individuals may be more vocal about it. If you think about it, how often do you go onto social media and say, I got my flu shot today, or I wore my mask today, or anything like that? I think that if you are doing the particular action, there's not much of there's not a very strong motivation to talk about it. So it's possible, Trey, I hadn't seen that figure before about the 59% of Americans always wearing a mask, but that's a very positive message. And as you know, that's completely different from where we were several months ago.
Yeah.
Well, that was in June, right? That information was from June.
Yeah, so that was June data. So, I mean, the problem is a lot of this, and as we're seeing, data collection takes time. And so, like, we would love to have rapid survey response data on how many people are wearing a mask today. But, I mean, it's hard to collect that data. And so actually one of our listeners pointed it out, like, where was Sweden in terms of cases at that point in time? So I thought I'd just throw up Sweden versus the US just so people can see where everybody is. Okay, so this is Our World in Data, which has like really good data if you want to look across countries. Obviously, the United States is we're number 1, but
Will you put it in linear just for me, because logs are so hard for me to interpret.
Yeah. Where is
on the side? I'm pointing to it. Why can't you see my finger?
I don't know.
There it is. It's highlighted.
There it is. Yep. Okay.
Okay, there you go.
Wow.
Wow, that hurts.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's linear.
That's part of the story right there, I think.
Yeah.
Well, but it is probably important to remember the United States has way more people too. So
Yes.
And this is, I think, total number of cases, right? 7-day rolling confirmed cases.
There's probably cases per capita somewhere, but that's all right. Yeah.
Well,
you got it right there, per million people.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
What just happened? There we go.
So I mean, it still tells a similar story, not quite as bad, but that line, that trend line, is not great. You know, the president of American Farm Bureau has coronavirus right now. The governor of Oklahoma, I mean, there are a lot of kind of high profile people right now that I think we're trying to sort out. Now, this is a question that also I just have for myself. You know, the governor of Oklahoma did an interview yesterday, and he sounded okay. You know, and so, you know, how much of this should like the average person still be concerned about versus people who have maybe elderly family members or, you know, people who are higher risk in terms of, you know, health profiles. You know, how does all of this shake out for the current and for kind of until we have a vaccine scenario?
The average person should be still very concerned.
Yeah.
Because we have we have indicators of what some risk factors for severe COVID-19 would be, but in other cases, it appears to be completely random. And you could be somebody who's young, relatively healthy, and still have a severe case. Not only that, but death is not the only outcome that we should be concerned about as far as COVID-19. We will still need to wait somewhat longer to understand how long-term some health effects may be. But there are many survivors of COVID-19 that even if their bodies have cleared the virus, that is, you know, a viral swab of the nasal cavity or the mouth, it doesn't reveal any virus, but there are still adverse effects that go on for a long time. And this could have been because of the systemic inflammation that they suffered as a result of COVID-19. One of the things that Dr. Fauci had talked about yesterday in his interview with Mark Zuckerberg, and I think it's a really interesting one, is that if you think about the progression of a COVID-19 case, and this is why we should all be concerned, there's a period in which, you know, in the early stage, well, hopefully none of us get infected, but if an individual is infected, the first stage is where it's really important, where the virus is replicating in our bodies. And the body is responding by trying to fight off the virus. And at that time, the type of medication that would be most helpful for us might be an antiviral medication or convalescent serum. But then in the more severe, the moderate to severe COVID-19 cases, in addition to the body trying to fight off the virus, there's also this massive inflammatory effect. And that is when our immune system just really kicks it up into high gear and is trying to kill off the virus. But the inflammation by which they do it, which is one of the mechanisms by which they do it, is also hurting a lot of our systems. It's hurting our blood vessels, our hearts, our lungs, our kidneys. I mean, even our central nervous system and our brains. It's scary. This is not a disease that anybody wants to take lightly. So a cavalier attitude toward this, I would say, is that's not an attitude that I would recommend to anyone. I think it can be.
I don't know if you've heard about this stuff. I just sometimes I find it fascinating to kind of see where people are getting their information or how they choose to operate. But have you heard about these coronavirus parties?
Yes.
Yeah.
Kids down in the South are having. So the New York Times had an article just earlier this week about a 30-year-old man who was healthy, went to one of these coronavirus parties. He won, and he died earlier this week. Like I think his last words were, "Oh man, I thought this was all just a hoax.
Exactly.
Probably made a bad mistake." And you know, so it's interesting to see how cavalier some people have become about this. You know, but again, I don't think it's everybody. I think still more than half of Americans take this very seriously.
Let me ask though. So you're right. The cavalier attitude is a small portion. A bigger concern for me is not people that are going to coronavirus parties, but the fact that it's late July and school is scheduled to start up, we think probably in August, probably for my 2 young children, and maybe September for MSU. What the heck, Felicia?
Oh my goodness. This is the kind of thing where I feel a little bit, so to put it as kind of mildly as I can, I'm very worried about it.
Okay.
And I think so. You probably have heard that Lansing School District has said that it's going to go entirely online in the fall. And I think that's a great idea. I'll just put it that way. And there are certain other universities that have said they are going to go entirely online, including the Cal State system, including Harvard, although it's allowing 40% of its students to be on campus. And again, I think that's a really great idea. And the reason is the following. I think it would be really wonderful to open up the schools in general, if under normal circumstances, of course, because our kids had to miss so many months of school in the spring. They want to see their friends, they want to participate in activities at the university level. It's just this wonderful social opportunity. But we have not, as a nation, brought COVID-19 levels down to a rate where it's safe to simply reopen everything. And again, we have to think on a case-by-case basis. There are certain parts of the US where COVID-19 cases are sufficiently low that if the kids went to school, then there wouldn't be a whole lot of risk of another spike. But we definitely can't say that that is the case for all of the US right now. Do I think that it would be possible? In the best possible case, to be honest, yes. If we all wore masks, if we all practiced social distancing and we were all simply wise about our interactions and tried to, minimize human contact or direct physical contact, that would be fantastic. Then the COVID-19 cases, they would run their course. It would be, it would take several weeks, but basically the curve would go down quite substantially. The proportion of individuals in the United States who are positive for COVID-19. And that means that it's much, much safer to have the normal social interactions that we were so used to having before this pandemic. But until we can get it down to just a handful of cases in a particular community, there's always going to be that risk of a whole bunch of kids coming together and then spreading to more individuals, spreading to their teachers, spreading to their families, to their parents, to their grandparents. It's pretty scary. We need to, and that's why, actually, if I could put in a plug on Closing Bell, if we really are going to go through this and we're going to open up schools in a month's time or 2 months' time, we have to be so serious about masking now. We have to be so serious about social distancing and being wise about our interactions, because then the schools are going to open. We have, I would say we still have a pocket of time in which we can really bring down the COVID-19 rates.
Really? Okay.
Everybody has to be on board.
I hope that, it does seem like there is some change in the zeitgeist this week, at least in terms of people wearing masks. The president wore a mask last week. We've seen Walmart stepping up enforcement. When I go into places, which I don't go into that many places, but it feels like more people are wearing masks than they were a month ago. And maybe I'm wrong. And the reason I say maybe I'm wrong is that, so I've got a graduate student who, he works at a grocery store now. He's a general manager at a grocery store, and he's trying to enforce mask protocol.
Mm-hmm.
Dude got a death threat last week for trying to enforce mask wearing.
Really?
Yeah, literally. And so, again, it's not the majority of people. It's a small minority of people who are really averse to this. But my understanding is it doesn't take a huge number of people with coronavirus to spread this stuff. And so, even a small minority of this group of people who aren't willing to wear masks can kind of ruin it for the rest of us. Am I understanding this correctly, or?
You are understanding it correctly. You've probably been reading about super spreaders.
Yeah.
About the individuals who, not necessarily because of their biology, because they're more likely to shed the virus, but just because they're the ones who will be out socializing without a mask. They'll be going into indoor spaces, and in particular, indoor spaces where there are other individuals who are not wearing masks, where the ventilation may not be that great. So what we see is that there are a lot of these super spreading events where there could be one individual and he or she is not biologically that different from others, but they may be infected. And then they go into this space and are talking with all these people, shouting in a loud voice and hugging everybody. And from there, they could spread COVID-19 to some other individuals. Those individuals then go home and spread it to other people. Mm-hmm. It could really blossom out of control.
We're diving into more and more bummer. This is just getting to be a bigger and bigger bummer as we carry on. Can I just ask one more bummer question, and then I swear we can turn to just like rainbows and butterflies if you guys want. I just wonder, again, because I've got two small kids, I'm still, you know, we're at the point where we're trying to make these decisions for our own family. So this is a big focus on my mind for students who are deciding whether to come to campus or not at MSU. This is a big thing on their mind. I wonder, Felicia, you said obviously there are all of these benefits of this in-person interaction. You get to see your friends, you get to learn in the classroom, and there's some kind of more subtle ways of communicating in person than there is online. I just wonder if coronavirus is still raging, which unless these miracle things that you said could slow it down, it looks like it probably will be. Doesn't the fact that we're wearing masks and shields and the students are wearing masks and shields when they're learning diminish some of those learning outcomes? And then for my kids, if they are all spaced 6 feet apart from their friends and they have to wear masks and they're standing far apart on the playground, doesn't that diminish some of those in-person benefits? I guess that was a leading question.
Yeah. I think it does. I mean, I think in any case, the interactions are going to change. When we've been, prior to the pandemic, when we were all interacting face to face, we can read a lot about a person's emotions, kind of understand where a conversation is going just by looking at their entire face. I think we communicate a lot of information that way. So of course, now if you have a mask that's covering up half your face, you are losing some of that information. You can try to glean how the individual is feeling maybe by looking at their eyes, but it's obviously it's not the same level of information that we as humans have learned how to pick up by interacting with other individuals in a shared physical space. It's going to be different. So yeah, with the face masks, with the protective hoods, with the distancing, that is certainly going to change interactions quite a lot. I don't think there's any way to say that is going to be the same as what it was, but I think the sooner that we can get this pandemic under control, the more quickly we can move to reducing some of those protections such that we can begin to interact in ways that we were used to interacting before the pandemic. And that's why I think it's so important, especially since we are concerned, well, you with your 2 kids, all of us with our kids, knowing that school is going to start, we really need to try to curb this pandemic as much as possible in the weeks to come.
And so as a goodish news thing, the way you started was to say we've made, Moderna and others have made great progress on these vaccines. Do you have an idea of, and you're not an immunologist, so you don't necessarily have to, but do you have an idea of the timeline of that stage 3, and then also the timeline from successful stage 3 to mass administration of this thing? What does that timeline look like?
Yes, so what I can repeat is what I had heard Dr. Fauci say, not just yesterday, but I guess about a month ago. And the fact that his message is consistent is a hopeful sign to me, which is that it's entirely likely that we will have a vaccine available to the general public by early next year, so January of 2021. And that will depend on a number of different things. The phase 3 clinical trials have to ensure that the safety is maintained across a large population and that it has a certain level of efficacy. But of course, it's not just this one mRNA vaccine from Moderna that's going to be tested. Soon there will be a number of other vaccine candidates that will be tested at those large levels. So there are multiple different types of vaccines, different vaccine platforms, like an inactivated virus, some mRNA, some other types, and they're all being developed simultaneously. I think this is all very good news. And if I can add even more positive news, because we should definitely end on a good note. Even before the vaccine comes out, and even before we we get the vaccine, there are two positive things going on. The companies are actually creating large amounts of these vaccines even before the phase 3 clinical trial.
Really? I didn't know that. Okay.
Yes, and I had just learned about this yesterday. I think that's wonderful news, because that means that we can quickly administer it to a large proportion of the population immediately if and when it gets approved. Of course, if it doesn't turn out to be, if it doesn't pass the phase 3 clinical trial, yes, that's a large economic loss, but these are extenuating circumstances. And that's why these companies are doing this. They've already prepared large amounts of the vaccine. So boom, the moment it gets approved, it can be administered to a large number of people. And the second positive point is that even before the vaccine comes out, we're getting better at managing this disease from a healthcare perspective. We know a lot more than we did in the past. And this may have been something that you've read about too recently in the news, that a study was done, and I can't remember if it was published in Lancet or elsewhere, that showed that at the end of March, the number of all the individuals that were admitted to the ICU in the United States for COVID-19, that 60% of them died of COVID-19. So, and
Really?
this includes even the individuals in the ICU who didn't have to be intubated, who didn't have to go on a ventilator.
Jeez.
Very high mortality rate. 60%. But then by the end of May, that mortality rate decreased to 40%.
Okay.
So
that's not great news.
I still don't like that number.
No, I know. Yeah, neither do I. So try to avoid the hospital if you can. But now,
well, maybe
I'm
go
not
to the
sure
hospital.
that's the
I wouldn't
conclusion
say that.
to draw.
Please go to the hospital.
Yeah. But it's good news. And now we're coming to the end of July. We know a lot more about. So, for example, we know we have other drugs that we've repurposed, like dexamethasone, which can help to control those. The cytokine storms, the extreme bouts of inflammation that themselves can increase the risk of death. We know about antivirals. We have convalescent serum available. We have all of these different treatments that are now available, and we know roughly better when we should be administering what type, depending on how far along the patient is in the COVID trajectory. So all of that information is quite reassuring. We do have more repurposed drugs. We have some new drugs available. We have more information about how to treat this.
Okay, so I got one more question. And so we're streaming on the Facebook College of Ag site right now. So everybody who's probably watching more than likely has at least some loose connection to Michigan State, or most people. Where does this leave Michigan State University? In terms of opening up, in terms of education platforms, in terms of anything. I know it's kind of a tough question. I would imagine you have way more information about this than I do. We're like a month away from supposed to be teaching. What do we tell students? How do we think this through right now, or can we?
Thinking about the students coming from all different parts of the U.S. and in some cases coming from different parts of the world, although that is there's a lot more kind of like barriers now.
Sure.
I think a message is, just be careful, be very careful in this next month. Wear a mask out in public places. Those individuals that you can influence that are living close to you, make sure that they stay safe. Then when everybody comes together again on campus, what does reassure me is that President Stanley now has required that all individuals wear masks both indoors and outdoors. And that is going to substantially curb the risk of transmission. I do feel some concerns about what would be happening, for example, in residential halls, because students can't be expected to sleep in dorms with a mask on.
Sure.
And there's going to be a fair amount of testing as well. If you were listening to any of the Spartan Fireside chats, you probably heard about that. So it's good that there will be many students being tested on a continual basis to try to understand who those individuals are, and then to do contact tracing to see who they had contact with, and then to isolate, quarantine, test. as far as schools opening, I mean, I think we have quite a good plan, but these next several weeks are absolutely critical for everybody that's going to be coming back to MSU, just to stay as safe as possible, wear a mask, be responsible about social distancing, etc., so that we have the best possible chance of a healthy group of individuals coming back in the fall. And this is true not just for MSU, but for all schools, all universities
Sure.
in the US.
I think we should leave it there, man.
I think that's good.
Felicia, thank you so much for coming back on and talking to us.
Pleasure.
I just feel like this should be your show, and Trey and I should just sit quietly.
No, you are both doing a fantastic job with these closing bell webinars.
I wouldn't go that far, but I appreciate you joining us. I mean, you always have a lot more insight, especially on the things that Aleks and I there's no way that we could even begin to know as much as you do. And even if we did, we wouldn't remember it. So I appreciate you being on to talk us through what's going on in the world.
Well, thank you.
Really appreciate you coming.
Okay, thanks a lot.
All right.
And you have a good weekend.
You too.
Thanks.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.